You think that belt makes you something special? Claire's voice was flat, almost bored. Son, I've been hit harder than you can swing by men who would make you cry just walking into the room. So I'm going to ask you one more time, walk away. Ethan Caldwell laughed. His boys laughed with him. The whole street was watching, and not one of them knew they were about to witness the moment this young man's entire world cracked open at the foundation. Nobody in Silver Creek knew who Claire Morgan really was. They were about to find out. If this story grips you from the first word, please subscribe to our channel and follow Claire's story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first time Ethan Caldwell pulled his truck into Silver Creek, he did it the way he did everything, loud, fast, and with both hands on the wheel like he owned whatever road was underneath him. He was 23 years old, 210 pounds of muscle, and competitive ego. And he had the kind of confidence that young men build when they've been winning long enough to forget what losing feels like. He'd just taken first place at the Regional Martial Arts Championship in Billings. Third consecutive year. The black belt around his waist wasn't new. He'd had it since he was 19, but something about that third win had shifted something inside him. He'd stopped training to get better. He'd started training to remind people how good he already was. Silver Creek was his mother's hometown. He'd moved back to help her after she had hip surgery, telling himself it was temporary, 3 months at most. He figured he'd train at the local gym, keep his edge, and leave when she was back on her feet. He wasn't planning to care about the town. He wasn't planning to know anyone. What he wasn't planning on was Claire Morgan. He saw her the first morning that he walked down Main Street looking for coffee. She was crouched outside the garage at the edge of the commercial strip, her hands already dark with grease at 9 in the morning, working on the underside of a vintage Indian motorcycle that looked older than half the buildings in town. She had her hair pulled back, work boots that had seen real use, and she wasn't paying attention to anything except the engine in front of her. Ethan walked past. He barely registered her. That was his first mistake. The garage was called Morgan's, and it had been on that corner for 31 years. Claire's father had opened it before she was born, and when she came back to Silver Creek 4 years ago, she'd taken over the lease and the equipment and the long list of regular customers who trusted that garage with their vehicles for decades. She was 38 years old. She had a quiet face, the kind that didn't give away what was behind it, and blue eyes that most people described as calm, but would have called unsettling if they'd looked long enough. She rarely raised her voice. She rarely had to. The town liked her, not the loud way people like someone who buys rounds at the bar or organizes the annual charity drive. They liked her the solid way, the way you like someone who shows up when they say they will, does what they say they'll do, and never asks for more credit than the job deserves. She fixed things, not just motorcycles and trucks, things. When old Ray Dunbar's snowplow broke down in February and he couldn't afford the parts, Claire ordered them herself and told him to pay her when he could. When the high school wanted someone to talk to the auto shop class about engine mechanics, she came in twice a week for a full semester without asking for $1. When Donna Briggs's ex-husband showed up drunk outside her house 2 years ago, it was Claire who walked across the street in the middle of the night, stood on the porch without saying a word, and waited until the man got back in his car and drove away. Nobody asked her how she'd known to do that. Nobody asked what she thought would have happened if he hadn't left. They just knew the situation had been handled. Ethan started training at the only gym in town, a place called Frontier Fitness, that sat above the hardware store and smelled like rubber mats and old sweat. It wasn't much, some free weights, a heavy bag in the corner, and a sparring area that was generous only if you'd never seen a real martial arts facility. But it had a heavy bag, and Ethan could work with a heavy bag. He trained hard. That part was real and always had been. Whatever else you could say about Ethan Caldwell, his commitment to his physical discipline was genuine. He was in the gym by 6 every morning, working combinations on the bag for 90 minutes before most of the town had poured their first cup of coffee. The problem wasn't how he trained. The problem was what he decided training meant about him. He started talking in the gym the way men sometimes do when they've got an audience and haven't learned yet that an audience isn't the same thing as respect. He talked about his championships. He talked about his record. He described techniques in detail to men who hadn't asked, and when anyone pushed back or questioned anything, he had a way of smiling that said he wasn't really listening to the objection. How long you been training? He asked Bobby Marsh, a 50-year-old mechanic who came in 3 mornings a week to stay loose. 20 years on and off, Bobby said. Ethan nodded in the way people nod when they're not actually acknowledging what you said. You compete? Nah, just like moving. You should compete, Ethan said, picking up his raps. You'd know where you actually stand. Bobby looked at him for a second. I know where I stand, he said quietly and went back to his workout. Ethan didn't hear the flatness in Bobby's voice. He was already thinking about his next combination. He started coming into Morgan's about 3 weeks after he arrived. Not for repairs his truck was in. He came in because he'd started seeing the garage as a useful shortcut between his mother's house and the gym, and because a few of the guys he'd met mentioned that Claire had some good tools for borrowing if you were working on your own vehicle. The first visit was neutral. He asked to borrow a torque wrench. Claire handed it over with a rate chart and asked him to sign his name and number in the borrow log, and that was the entire transaction. She didn't make small talk. She didn't ask about his truck. She went straight back to the engine she was rebuilding. He came back the next week. This time he tried to start a conversation. You do good business here, he asked, looking around the garage with the evaluating look of someone who's decided to have an opinion. Good enough, Claire said, not looking up. Seems like a tough market. Town this small. I manage. You do all the work yourself. Mostly. Danny Reyes helps me 3 days a week. He leaned against the workbench. You ever think about expanding, getting a real shop, more staff? Claire set down her wrench. She looked at him with an expression that wasn't hostile, but wasn't inviting either, the expression of someone who has heard 1,000 versions of this conversation and knows exactly where it ends. This is a real shop, she said, and I'm not interested in expanding. I'm interested in finishing this carb rebuild before end of the day. Right, sure, Ethan said, backing off in a way that wasn't quite backing off. Just seems like you could do more with the space. Claire picked up her wrench and went back to work. The wrench is due back by Friday. He left, but he kept coming back. It became a pattern. He'd find a reason to stop in the borrow log, a question about a part, sometimes just to stand in the open garage bay and make conversation that mostly went one direction. Claire answered what she answered and ignored what she ignored, and her patience for him seemed to have no bottom, which he mistook for interest. You lift, he asked her one afternoon. Some. You should come to Frontier. I could show you some techniques, improve your conditioning. Claire looked at him over her shoulder. I'm good, she said. It's not a criticism, just saying everyone can improve. I know I can improve, she said. That's different from needing your help to do it. He laughed a little, the way he laughed when he didn't quite know what to do with a response. Fair enough. He was back 2 days later. The thing was, it wasn't malice, not yet. Ethan wasn't a bad person at his core. His mother had raised him to work hard and be honest, and those roots were still in there somewhere under everything that the winning had built on top of them. He was just young and full of himself in the way that young men sometimes get full of themselves, and he'd never met anyone who didn't eventually react to his credentials, who didn't eventually shift slightly in how they held themselves once they understood who they were talking to. Claire didn't shift. She was exactly the same whether he just won a championship or walked in off the street for the first time. It confused him. It nagged at him in a way he couldn't quite name. He started to interpret her consistency as dismissal. And Ethan Caldwell did not like being dismissed. And the trouble started on a Tuesday in early October, 3 weeks before the first real frost. Bobby Marsh brought his truck into Morgan's for a brake job, and he was still there waiting in one of the old metal chairs by the entrance when Ethan came in to return the torque wrench. 3 other people were in the garage that morning: Danny Reyes, who was Claire's part-time helper, an older woman named Peg Callahan, who'd brought in her Subaru for a noise inspection, and a teenager named Marcus Webb, who helped Claire with cleanup on Tuesdays. Ethan came in loud. He'd been on the phone in the parking lot wrapping up what sounded like a victory conversation about something. His body language was charged the way it got when he'd just been reminded of how good he was at something, and he walked in without checking whether Claire was occupied. She was in the middle of bleeding the brake lines on Bobby's truck lying partway under the vehicle, and she had her hands full. Hey, Ethan said, setting the wrench on the workbench with a clang that made Marcus jump. I need to talk to you about that left front axle issue I mentioned. You have a second? Not right now, Claire said from under the truck. Finishing a job. It'll only take a minute. Ethan, her voice was calm, but it had something in it now that it hadn't had before. I'm in the middle of a brake job. I'll be done in 20 minutes. Come back or wait. He leaned against the workbench. He looked around at the other people in the garage with an expression that was trying to be casual but was reading as impatient. I could actually do this myself if you just tell me where the parts are, he said. I know what I'm doing with an axle. I'm sure you do, Claire said. This isn't your garage. I'm just saying I could help. Bobby Marsh from his chair by the door said quietly, Son, she asked you to wait. Ethan looked at him. I'm not talking to you. The garage got quiet in a specific way, the kind of quiet that means everyone in the room just registered something at the same time. Bobby didn't react. He just looked at Ethan for a moment, then looked back at his phone. Claire slid out from under the truck. She stood up slowly, wiping her hands on a shop rag, and looked at Ethan with those calm blue eyes that suddenly felt about 8 degrees colder than they had a minute ago. Bobby Marsh has been coming to this garage for 15 years, she said. You've been coming for 3 weeks. When he tells you something in here, you listen. That's how this works. Ethan's jaw tightened. He was used to being the youngest person in a room and having people defer to him anyway because of what he could do. Being corrected by a woman in front of an audience hit something in him that he hadn't expected. I wasn't being disrespectful, he said, his voice dropping in a way that was supposed to sound controlled. That's the interesting part, Claire said. You never think you are. She turned back to the truck. Come back at noon if you want to talk about the axle. He left. He didn't come back at noon. For the next week, he stayed away from Morgan's. He told himself he didn't need the borrow log anyway, he could order his own tools. And besides, the woman had no sense of professional courtesy, and he didn't need to put up with that. But he was talking about her. To the guys at the gym, to a couple of people he'd become friendly with at the diner on 4th Street. Not talking about her the way you talk about someone when you're angry at them directly, more the way you talk about something that's gotten under your skin and you can't quite dislodge. She acts like she runs the whole town, he said to Davis Finch, who was wrapping his hands at the gym on Thursday morning. Davis was 42 and had lived in Silver Creek his whole life. He looked at Ethan carefully. Claire, yeah. Davis was quiet for a second. She kind of does run a piece of it, he said. What happened? Ethan explained. Davis listened. When Ethan finished, Davis said, she told you to wait 20 minutes while she was under a truck bleeding a brake line, and you think that's her being difficult? She talked to me like I was a kid. Davis stopped rapping. How'd you come in? What? How'd you come in? What was your vibe? Ethan didn't have an answer for that he liked. Davis said, look, man, Claire Morgan is good people. Whatever happened, I'd let it go. She's not someone you want issues with. Why, what's she going to do? Davis looked at him the way adults sometimes look at other adults who are asking questions they should be able to answer themselves. It's not about what she's going to do, he said. It's about who she is. This is a small town. She's been here 4 years, and she's more a part of this place than most people who were born here. That's not nothing. Ethan heard the words. He didn't take them in. The community event that broke everything open was Silver Creek's annual Harvest Day, which the town had been running for 26 years, and which amounted to the closest thing they had to a real civic celebration. The main street was blocked off. There were food booths and live music, and pretty much everyone in the county came in for it. It was the kind of event where you saw everyone you knew and half the people you'd been successfully avoiding. Claire was there running a booth with Ray Dunbar, raising money for the Volunteer Fire Department's equipment fund. She'd helped organize it for the past 3 years. She was behind the table when Ethan arrived with a group of his friends from the gym, and he spotted her from halfway down the block. He'd been drinking since noon. Not drunk, he had enough physical discipline to keep himself on the right side of that line, but loose enough that the things that usually stayed under the surface were sitting a little closer to his mouth. He walked over to her booth. His friends came with him because his friends were in the habit of following where he went. Nice booth, he said. Thanks, Claire said. She was filling cups from a thermos and didn't look up right away. Fire department thing. Yeah, great cause. You want to donate? Maybe. He put his hands on the edge of the table. Listen, I wanted to apologize for the other week. I think we got off on the wrong foot. Claire looked at him then. Her expression was measured. Apology accepted, she said. That should have been the end of it. That was the clear end point of the interaction, and anyone paying attention would have taken it and walked away. But Ethan's friends were behind him, and one of them, Tyler Bryce, who was 22, and whose primary function in the group was to make everything louder, said, "Man, I didn't know the fire department hired mechanics to run their fundraisers." It was a stupid joke, a nothing comment from a nothing moment, but it got a laugh from the other guys, and Claire heard it, and something in the air shifted. Claire looked at Tyler with a look that didn't change her face at all and said, "They don't. I'm a volunteer." "Volunteer," Tyler repeated, drawing the word out like it was funny. Like they couldn't find anyone better, so, "Tyler," Ethan said it to his credit, but he said it the way you say someone's name when you want them to keep going, but need to pretend you're pulling them back. "I'm just saying," Tyler continued, "seems like a lot of work for someone who fixes bikes for a living. Most of the work in this town gets done by people who do other things for a living," Claire said, still calm. "That's how communities function." "Sure, sure." Tyler leaned on the table from his side. "Must be nice, though, having all your biker friends to back you up. I heard you know some people." The way he said it was needling. It was designed to sound like an innocent question while meaning something else. He'd clearly heard something about Claire, some rumor or piece of secondhand information, and he was using it to probe. Claire looked at Tyler for a long moment. Then she looked at Ethan. "You should take your friend somewhere else," she said. "Why fussy?" Ethan said. "He's just talking. He's trying to start something, and you're letting him." "No one's starting anything." Ray Dunbar, who was standing beside Claire and had been quiet through the whole exchange, said softly, "Ethan, this isn't the place." "I'm not doing anything," Ethan said, and his voice had the particular edge that comes when someone's been drinking and decides their grievance is justified. What happened next came out of that edge. It came out of 3 weeks of feeling dismissed, of being corrected in front of people, of standing in a garage and feeling like someone was looking through him instead of at him. It came out of Tyler's laughter and the crowd that was starting to gather, because crowds always gather when they sense the quality of air that was currently sitting over that booth. Ethan said loud enough for people to hear, "Everyone in this town acts like you're some kind of legend, but you're just a mechanic. You fix bikes. That's it. So let's stop pretending you're something you're not." The words landed, not like an explosion, like a stone dropped into still water. They spread out in every direction from the center of where they'd been spoken, and every person within hearing distance felt the ripple. Claire set down the cup she was holding. She looked at Ethan with an expression that finally, for the first time since he'd known her, let him see something behind the calm. It wasn't anger. That was what surprised him. It wasn't offense or hurt or the defensive scrambling he'd expected. It was something closer to recognition. The look of someone who has seen this particular moment before and knows exactly how it ends. "You want to say that again?" she asked. Quiet, even. "I just did," he said. "Okay," Claire said. She came around from behind the table. She was shorter than him by 5 inches and probably outweighed him by 70 pounds less, and she stood in front of him in the middle of the street with a crowd forming around them, and she said, "You think I'm just a mechanic? Fine, but you've been coming into my shop for a month trying to get my attention, and you're still here standing in front of my booth on a day you could have been anywhere else. So what does that tell you about who's chasing who?" Someone in the crowd laughed. It wasn't Tyler. Ethan's face went red. "I'm not chasing anyone," he said. I'm pointing out that you've been walking around this town like your reputation gives you some kind of pass. And nobody wants to say it, so I will. You're not special. You're just someone who's been here a few years and learned how to seem important." "Seem important," Claire repeated. "Yeah." She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "You've won 3 regional championships. I know, I looked you up after the first time you came into my shop and told me how to run my business." She paused. "You're good, genuinely. At 23 with 3 regional titles, you're objectively talented." Ethan blinked. He hadn't expected that. "But you know what your problem is," Claire continued. "You've been winning for so long that you've confused winning with being right. And those are 2 completely different things. And I suppose you're the one who's going to teach me the difference." "I'm not interested in teaching you anything," she said. "I'm interested in getting back to my booth and finishing what I came here to do. But you're standing in my way. So, what's it going to be?" He looked at her. The crowd was pressed in on both sides now. 20 people, 30 more coming. Tyler had gone quiet. Even the music from 2 blocks down had seemed to fade. Something in Ethan snapped. It was the accumulated weight of everything: the garage, the correction in front of Bobby Davis's careful warning that he hadn't listened to, and now this woman standing in front of him on a public street, talking to him like he was a first-year student. "You want to settle this right here," he said. He meant it as a bluff. He told himself he meant it as a bluff. Claire looked at him with those blue eyes that didn't change. "No," she said. "I don't want to settle anything. But I'll tell you one more time, and I need you to really hear this because I'm not going to say it again. Walk away. Go enjoy the rest of the event. This doesn't have to be what it's turning into." "Or what?" Ethan said. And that was when Bobby Marsh's voice came through the crowd, steady and tired. "Son, she's giving you a way out. Take it." "I don't need a way out," Ethan said. He turned back to Claire. "Show me what you've got then. If you're such a legend, show me." The crowd went completely silent. Claire looked at him for a long moment. And then she said quietly, so quietly, that the people in the back of the crowd couldn't hear it, so quietly that only he and the 3 or 4 people closest to them caught the words she said. "If I show you what I've got, Ethan, this conversation is over. And I don't mean the conversation we're having right now. I mean every conversation you and I have had since you walked into my town and decided you had something to prove to someone who never asked you to prove it." He stepped forward. He put his hands up in the ready position he'd built over a decade of competition, standing there in the middle of Silver Creek's Main Street, in front of the fire department fundraiser booth, in front of 35 people who'd grown quiet as a held breath. And Claire Morgan, who had not moved, who had not shifted her weight or adjusted her stance or done a single thing to indicate she was in any kind of confrontation at all, looked at him with an expression that did something he hadn't encountered before. She looked at him like she felt sorry for him. Not the cheap kind of sorry, not the condescending kind, the real kind, the kind that comes from seeing exactly where a person is and knowing the distance between where they are and where they think they are. "You don't want this," she said. "Try me," he said. And somewhere on the edge of town, so far away that at first it could have been thunder, came a sound. Low, rhythmic, growing. Engines. Not one, not 5, dozens. The sound rolled through Silver Creek, the way weather rolls through a mountain town, filling every space at once, vibrating in the chest before you consciously heard it with your ears. People at the far end of the street turned. The conversation that had been building for a month, that had been building for 3 weeks in the gym and in the garage and the diner and the Harvest Day crowd, suddenly felt very small against that sound. Ethan heard it. He couldn't help it. He lowered his hands half an inch. Just half an inch. But Claire saw it. She saw it, and something in her face settled, not relief, but resolution. The look of someone who's been waiting for something to arrive, and now it has. She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on Ethan, and she said very quietly, "Those are my people, and they're not here because I called them. They're here because they always show up for Harvest Day. They have for the last 3 years." The engines got louder and louder, and then the first bikes turned onto Main Street, and everything Ethan Caldwell thought he understood about Claire Morgan and about Silver Creek and about what real strength looked like began very slowly to come apart. The first bike that turned onto Main Street was a Road King black in chrome running pipes that spoke in a frequency you didn't just hear. You felt it in your back teeth and behind your sternum. Then the second, then 5 more behind it, then a line of them stretching back around the corner that didn't seem to end, 24 bikes, maybe more, filling the street with the kind of presence that makes people stop what they're doing and just stand there. Because some things you don't ignore on instinct. Ethan's hands came all the way down. He didn't decide to drop them. They just came down the way your arms drop when the thing you were ready to fight turns out to be a different category of problem than you were prepared for. He stood in the middle of the street with 30 people pressed in around him and watched the column of motorcycles roll through Silver Creek like a river that had decided to change its course and run right through the center of town. Claire still hadn't turned around. That was the part that got him. That was the thing his brain kept snagging on, even as the bikes multiplied and the engine noise filled every available inch of air on the block. She was standing 3 feet in front of him, close enough that he could see the line of her jaw and the set of her shoulders, and she had not turned around to look. Like she already knew exactly what was back there. Like the fact of it was so familiar to her that checking would have been the strange thing to do. The lead bike stopped. The rider was somewhere in his late 50s, big through the chest and shoulders with a beard that had gone mostly gray and hands that looked like they'd done decades of real work. He pulled off his helmet and looked at the scene in front of him. The crowd, the booth behind Claire, Ethan standing with his hands at his sides, and his eyes settled on Claire with an expression that was quiet and direct. "You good," he said. 2 words, not shouted, just spoken in a voice that carried the way voices carry when they're used to being listened to. Claire said, "I'm good, Frank." The man named Frank nodded once. He looked at Ethan with the particular flatness of someone who has assessed a situation and reached a conclusion and is not in a hurry to explain it. Then he looked back at Claire. "Heard there was a fundraiser." "There is. Ray's got the table covered if you want to donate." "We'll donate," Frank said. He put his helmet back on and pulled the bike forward and parked at the curb. And behind him, the rest of the column did the same. A choreography that wasn't a choreography at all, but just the result of people who had been doing something together for long enough that it looked like they'd rehearsed. 24 Harley Davidsons lined up along Main Street in under a minute, riders climbing off helmets, coming off, people stretching and talking among themselves like they'd just arrived at a place they came to regularly. Because they had, the crowd around Ethan began to break apart. Not all at once, people lingered because the curiosity hadn't cleared. But in the specific way, crowds dissolve when the main event has shifted and everyone's recalibrating where the center of gravity is now. Tyler Bryce had already taken 3 steps backward without appearing to realize he was doing it. Ethan stood where he was. Claire turned around then. She looked at Frank, who had walked to the donation table and was talking to Ray Dunbar, and then she turned back to Ethan and said, "Still want to settle something?" He didn't answer. "I didn't think so," she said. And she walked back around to her side of the booth, picked up the cup she'd set down, and went back to work like none of it had happened. He drove home that night without talking to anyone. He sat in his truck in his mother's driveway for 20 minutes before he went inside, which was something he hadn't done since the night before his first major competition at 16, when he'd been too knotted up with nerves to walk through the door and face the ordinary world on the other side of it. His mother was watching television. She called to him when she heard him come in. He told her he was tired and went upstairs and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. He kept going back to the same 3 things. The way Frank had said 2 words, and that had been the whole thing. No threat, no posturing, no performance of authority. Just 2 words and the quiet assumption underneath them that the answer would be whatever it was, and that whatever it was, things would proceed accordingly. The way Claire had stood with her back to all of it, and the way she looked at him when he'd stepped forward with his hands up, that expression that had no anger in it, that expression that he'd thought in the moment was pity, and that he was now sitting in the dark reconsidering. Because it hadn't been the pity that you feel when someone is beneath you. It had been the pity that you feel when you recognize someone doing something that's going to cost them, and you can't stop them, and you've already said everything you were willing to say. He pulled out his phone and typed her name into the search bar. Claire Morgan, Silver Creek, Montana. There wasn't much. A few local news mentions a quote from her in a piece about the volunteer fire department, her name in the acknowledgments of the high school auto program, a 2-year-old article about the garage being recognized by the County Chamber of Commerce for community service. Normal stuff, small town stuff. He searched differently. He looked up the bike, the Road King he'd seen Frank riding. He looked up the patches he'd glimpsed on the vests of the riders as they'd pulled past him. He'd been too shaken in the moment to look clearly, but he'd seen enough. The Death's Head, the rocker patches, Hell's Angels. He put his phone face down on the bed and sat with that for a while. Davis Finch was at the gym at 6:15 the next morning, and Ethan was already there, and that was how that conversation started. Not because Ethan wanted to have it, but because Davis walked in and looked at him with an expression that said he'd already heard what had happened on Main Street and was deciding how to handle knowing it. "You saw?" Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "Half the town saw," Davis said, dropping his bag. "The other half heard about it by this morning." Ethan kept punching the bag. "Who are they?" Davis said. "The guys on the bikes." "Yeah." Davis wrapped his hands slowly. "You really want the answer to that?" "I just asked, didn't I?" Frank Caruso runs the chapter out of Billings. They've been stopping through Silver Creek every harvest day for the past 3 years because Claire asked them to come support the fire department fundraiser. They ride up, they donate, they have lunch, they leave. That's the whole thing. It's not a display. They're not here to scare anybody. They just come because she asked. Ethan stopped punching. She asked them. Frank Caruso has been riding with Claire since she was in her mid-20s. I don't know the whole story and I don't ask. What I know is that when her husband died and he was one of them, one of their chapter, they didn't walk away from her. They stayed in her life. They're her family. That's the word Frank used one time, family, and that's the only time I've ever heard him explain it. Ethan processed that. Her husband was in the club. Yeah, died in a road accident about 5 years ago, before she came here. The gym had a particular quality of silence when no one was hitting anything. Ethan heard the ventilation and nothing else. She never said anything, he said, and he knew how it sounded even as he said it. Did you ask? Davis said. No answer. Did you ask anything about her at all? Davis continued. That wasn't really about what you were trying to tell her. That one landed. Ethan felt it land, the way you feel a combination that gets through your guard, not as pain exactly, but as undeniability. The physical fact that something has made contact. He picked up his water bottle. He took a long drink. How much trouble am I in? He said. Davis looked at him. With the club, none. They're not going to come looking for you, Ethan. It's not how this works. They're not interested in you. With the town, Davis thought about it. That depends on what you do next. What he did next was nothing. For 4 days, he did nothing, which was its own kind of action, the action of sitting with something you can't think your way out of and waiting to see if the discomfort will resolve itself without you having to move toward it directly. It didn't resolve. I was at the diner on the 5th day when Claire walked in. She came in alone, ordered coffee and eggs at the counter, and sat reading something on her phone while she ate. She was 3 stools away from him. She acknowledged him the way she acknowledged the napkin dispenser. She registered his existence as a fact of the environment and moved on. That was somehow worse than anger. He said, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" She looked up. About what happened at Harvest Day. She looked at him for a moment. What about it? I want to. He stopped. He'd rehearsed something, several versions of something, over the 4 days he'd been sitting with it, and all of them sounded right in his head. And he could hear now that none of them were going to sound right out loud. I behaved badly, he said. That's it. I don't have an explanation that excuses it. I behaved badly, and I said things in public that I said because I was embarrassed, and I took it out on you, and that was wrong. Claire watched him while he said it. Her expression didn't change. Okay, she said. Okay, you accept the apology, or okay, you heard it. Both, she said. Why does it have to be one or the other? He didn't have an answer for that. She went back to her phone for a moment. Then she said without looking up, "You know what your actual problem is? Not the arrogance you already know about the arrogance everyone's told you about the arrogance. Your actual problem is that you've been waiting for someone to be impressed by you so long that you've forgotten how to be impressed by anyone else." He sat with that. That's a hard way to live, she said. I know because I lived a version of it when I was younger. He looked at her. Don't act surprised. She put her phone down and picked up her coffee. I was 24. I was good at things. I thought being good at things was the same as being worth something. Then I met my husband and he introduced me to 30 people who were genuinely extraordinarily good at things, and not one of them needed you to know about it. That was the first time I understood the difference. Frank Caruso. She looked at him steadily. Among others. I looked it up, he said. After Harvest Day, I figured out who they were. I know you did, she said. Everybody does eventually. Were you ever, he was trying to ask something he didn't have the right vocabulary for. I rode, she said simply. I still do sometimes. When Frank's chapter does charity runs or benefit rides, I go. When they pass through, I'm there. My husband was a full patch member for 11 years before he died. I'm not a member, I never was. But they're my people, they were his people. That's not something that stops. The diner was quiet around them. Someone at the back booth was laughing at something on their phone. The cook was moving around in the kitchen. Ethan said, "I'm sorry about your husband." Claire was quiet for a moment. Just a moment, and then it passed, and she looked at him with an expression that was closed in the specific way that old grief is closed, not hidden, just settled the way scar tissue settles. "Thank you," she said. She went back to her breakfast. He sat there for a minute longer. Then he said, "Can I ask you something? You can try. When I put my hands up, in the street, he paused. Were you scared? She looked at him. And then it was the first time he'd seen this, the first time in all the weeks he'd been coming into her garage and reading her wrong. She smiled. Not a big smile, just a quiet one, the kind that's more in the eyes than anywhere else. No, she said, because of Frank being there. No, she said again. Frank wasn't there yet. He felt that roll through him slowly. Then why not? She picked up her coffee. Because I knew something you didn't. He waited. She said, I knew you weren't really going to do it. I've been around men who were actually really going to do it, and you weren't that. You were angry and you were embarrassed and you were trying to save face in front of your friends, and all of that is real, but it isn't the same thing as a man who's actually willing to cross a line he can't come back from. You weren't that man. I could see it. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. How he said, because of the way you looked at Bobby Marsh when Tyler started running his mouth, she said, for just a second, you told Tyler to pull back. You tried. It didn't work, but you tried. A man who's truly willing to cross the line doesn't do that. He lets it roll. She set down her cup. You were in over your head and you were too proud to admit it. That's a completely different problem. I thought about that conversation for days. He turned it over the way you turn over something that's both simpler and more complicated than you expected it to be, something that resolves one question and opens three more. He started doing something different at the gym. Not dramatic, not some sudden conversion, small stuff. When Marcus Webb, who was 17 and had started coming to Frontier Fitness on his own, a few weeks back was working on his stance and getting it consistently wrong. Ethan didn't walk over and demonstrate how it should look. He walked over and asked Marcus what he was trying to do. And when Marcus explained, Ethan said, okay, try this small adjustment, and let Marcus work through it himself. Marcus got it on the third try. The look on his face when he felt it click was something Ethan hadn't seen on someone's face in a long time, because he'd been so focused on his own face in competition moments that he'd forgotten other people had them. I went back to Morgan's the second week of October. No errand, no borrowed tool, nothing to justify the visit except the visit itself. He walked in and said, I don't have a reason to be here. I just wanted to see if there was anything I could do. Claire looked at him from under the hood of a Chevy pickup. You know anything about fuel injection systems? Some. Then you can hand me that cleaner on the second shelf and tell me what you know. He handed her the cleaner. He told her what he knew. She listened, corrected two things, and they worked in silence for 20 minutes. While the radio played something old and country from the battered speaker on the workbench. It was, he realized later, the most comfortable he'd felt in Silver Creek since he'd arrived. Frank Caruso came back to town alone 10 days after Harvest Day. He didn't announce it, didn't text ahead. He pulled up to Morgan's on a Thursday afternoon and came inside, and Claire looked up from the bench and said, Frank. And he said, Claire. And that was the greeting. Ethan was there. He'd started coming by 2 or 3 times a week, doing whatever was useful, handing tools, holding things in place, making coffee runs. He'd asked Claire once if she wanted him to stop, and she'd said, if I wanted you to stop, I'd tell you to stop. And that had been the arrangement ever since. Frank registered his presence the way he'd registered it on Main Street, with a complete lack of surprise and a deliberate lack of judgment. He sat in the metal chair by the door, the one Bobby Marsh usually occupied, and he looked at Ethan and said, You're the kid from the street. Yeah, Ethan said. Ethan Caldwell. Yeah, Frank nodded. You any good at what fighting? Ethan glanced at Claire, who was watching a spark plug with a focused expression that suggested she was deliberately not watching what was happening behind her. 3-time regional champion, Ethan said. Regional, Frank repeated not unkindly. What style? Mixed. Ground game and striking. Ever been in a situation where the rules were different? Ethan knew what he was asking. No, he said honestly. Frank nodded again. That's the difference, he said, between training and knowing. That's what Claire said. Frank looked at Claire's back for a moment. She say that exactly, something like it. She usually says something like what needs to be said, Frank said. It's one of her less annoying qualities, Claire said without turning around. I can hear you. I know, Frank said, and there was a warmth in his voice that was brief and real and not performed for anyone's benefit. He stayed for an hour. He talked to Ethan in the particular way that men with extensive experience talk to younger men when they've decided the younger man is worth talking to directly without softening things that didn't need softening, but also without the point scoring that Ethan was used to from his own circle. Frank didn't need Ethan to know how much he knew. He was just talking. Claire's husband was the best man I ever knew, Frank said at one point. And I've known a lot of men. He looked at his hands. He wasn't tough because he could fight. He was tough because he could take a hit and decide what it meant and keep going. That's rarer than people think. Ethan was quiet. She's got that too, Frank said. Always did. When he died, she came apart. Anybody would losing someone like that. But she put herself back together her own way, on her own timetable, and she came out here and built something from nothing. The garage, the volunteering, the relationships with people in this town. She built all of it. He looked at Ethan. That's what real strength looks like. It doesn't put its hands up in the middle of a street festival. The sentence was flat, not cruel, but it landed fully. No, Ethan agreed. It doesn't. Frank stood up. He shook Ethan's hand, a real handshake, the kind where you can feel what the other person thinks of you, in the grip, in the duration. And then he walked over to Claire and they spoke quietly for a few minutes about something Ethan couldn't hear. And then Frank left. The garage was quiet after he went, just the radio and the sounds of work. After a while, Claire said without turning around, "He liked you. How can you tell?" "Because he talked to you." Ethan looked at the door Frank had walked out of. "He told me about your husband. He does that sometimes, when he thinks someone should know. What was his name?" She was quiet for one breath too. "James," she said. "James Morgan. He was the best mechanic I've ever known. Better than me, and I'm not easy to be better than." A pause. He would have thought this whole situation was hilarious, by the way. You coming in here and trying to outpresence a woman who spent 8 years writing with the Billings chapter. Something cracked open in Ethan's chest. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was in the neighborhood of one. "I didn't know," he said. "Nobody knows until they know," Claire said. "That's the whole problem." She set down her tool and turned around and looked at him with that level gaze that he had stopped finding unreadable and had started finding, instead clarifying the look of someone who saw things as they were without needing to soften or complicate them. "You're going to be fine," she said. "Not because of what you can do, because of what I've watched you do in the last 2 weeks when you thought no one was paying particular attention." He didn't ask what she meant. He thought he understood. And if he was honest with himself, which was something he was getting marginally better at, he thought maybe that was the thing the championship belt had never actually given him. Not the acknowledgement of being good, the acknowledgement of being worth watching when the performance was over and the real person showed up. He picked up the shop rag off the bench and went back to work. Outside on Main Street, Silver Creek moved through its ordinary. Thursday, and 2 blocks away, a phone was ringing in an office above the hardware store, and the person on the other end of that call was about to say something that would change the temperature of everything that had felt just for this hour, like it might be settling into something solid. But that was still a few minutes away. For now, there was just the garage and the radio and the work. The phone call that changed everything came not to the garage, but to Ray Dunbar's house at 7:40 on a Friday morning, 3 days after Frank Caruso had driven out of Silver Creek with a handshake that still sat in Ethan's memory like a tuning fork that hadn't stopped vibrating. Ray was 71 years old, had lived in Silver Creek his entire life, and owned the property that Morgan's garage sat on. He'd inherited it from his father, who'd rented it to Claire's father before her, and the arrangement between the Dunbar family and the Morgan family had been running on handshakes and reasonable rent and mutual goodwill for longer than most people in town had been alive. Ray didn't see property as leverage. He saw it as responsibility, which was why he'd never raised Claire's rent beyond what made sense, and why, when the boiler in her building cracked 2 winters ago, he'd split the repair costs without being asked. The voice on the other end of the call was not a voice Ray recognized. "Mr. Dunbar, my name is Gregory Vance. I'm calling on behalf of Meridian Property Holdings. We've been made aware that you hold the deed to a commercial property at 1411 Main Street in Silver Creek, Montana, currently operating as an automotive service business." Ray said, "Morgan's Garage, that's right. We'd like to discuss an acquisition offer. I think you'll find the number quite attractive." Ray sat down at his kitchen table because he was 71, and when things came at him from directions he wasn't expecting, he'd learned to get himself seated first. "I'm not looking to sell," he said. "I understand. Most property owners say that initially. Would you be willing to at least hear the figure? Ray heard the figure. It was 3 times what the property was worth by any reasonable assessment. He told the man he'd think about it and hung up, and then he sat at his kitchen table for a long time with his coffee going cold in front of him before he picked up his phone and called Claire. She answered on the second ring the way she always did, like she'd been expecting the call without knowing it was coming. "Ray," she said, "early for you." "Got a call this morning," he said, "from a company called Meridian Property Holdings. You heard of them?" A pause, short but there. "No," she said. "What did they want?" "They want to buy the building." Another pause, longer this time. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I'd think about it." "Claire, they offered." He said the number. She was quiet long enough that he checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then she said, "That's not a real offer, Ray. That's a pressure number. Nobody pays 3 times market value unless they're trying to move you fast before you can think straight." "That was my feeling too," he said, "but I wanted to call you first." "I appreciate that." Her voice was controlled the way it got when she was managing something internally that she wasn't ready to put into words yet. "Do you know what they're trying to build or buy up?" He didn't say, just said the property was attractive to them for development purposes. "Development," she repeated, and the word landed in a specific way, flat and heavy. "I'm not selling," Ray said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you this because you have a right to know, and because I don't think this is the last call I'm going to get." "No," Claire said quietly. "I don't think it is either." She didn't say anything to Ethan when he came in that morning. She worked the way she always worked, focused and efficient. But he'd been around her enough by now to notice the difference between her baseline quiet and the kind of quiet that had something running underneath it. This was the second kind. She answered his questions in shorter sentences. She didn't make a coffee run at 10 like she usually did. When Danny Reyes came in for his shift and said something about the weather, she gave him a response that was 3 words shorter than it should have been. Ethan waited until Danny was out in the bay working on a truck before he said, "Something happened." She looked at him. "What makes you say that?" "Because you've been present every other time I've been in here, and today you're not. You're somewhere else." She considered him for a moment with an expression that was recalibrating something. Then she told him about Ray's call. He listened without interrupting, which was something he was getting better at. When she finished, he said, "Meridian Property Holdings. Do you want me to look them up?" "I already did this morning. They're real incorporated out of Denver, 4 years old. They've done 3 other small-town commercial acquisitions in Montana and Wyoming in the last 2 years. They flip properties for retail development, strip malls, chain restaurants, drive-thrus." He felt the weight of that settle. They want to turn this corner into something that makes them money," she said. "The garage is incidental to that. I'm incidental to that." Ray said he's not selling. Ray is 71 and on a fixed income, and someone just offered him 3 times market value for a piece of land he's been holding for 30 years. She wasn't saying this with blame. She was saying it the way you say a true thing that hurts directly because softening it doesn't make it less true. "I don't want to find out what his number actually is." Ethan thought about that. "What's your lease situation?" 2 years left on the current term. After that, she stopped. "After that, it's up to Ray. So if they buy, then my lease becomes their problem and they become mine." She picked up a wrench and set it back down without using it. "I've been in this garage for 4 years. My dad's name is still on the original equipment invoice. This is not a place I can walk away from and set up somewhere else like it doesn't mean what it means." Ethan said, "Then we don't let them take it." She looked at him. "We." "Yeah," he said, and he said it without thinking about whether it was the right word, which was how he knew it was. The second call came to Ray on Monday. This time the number was higher. He called Claire immediately and she came over to his house for the first time in the 2 years since she'd helped him with the boiler situation, and she sat at his kitchen table in the same chair he'd been sitting in when he'd taken the first call, and they talked for 2 hours about what the property meant and what the offer meant and what saying yes would cost both of them in ways the money didn't cover. Ray was not a man who could be called greedy, but he was a man who was old enough to understand that money at a certain point stopped being abstract and started being the difference between a particular quality of life and its absence. He'd had 2 hip replacements. His truck needed work he kept putting off. His daughter in Bozeman had 3 kids and a husband whose job had gone contract only, and the monthly calls had taken on a quality of strain that Ray heard and didn't mention. "I'm not saying yes," he told Claire, "but I need you to hear that I'm not saying no forever either." She heard that. She took it in without flinching. "What's your timeline?" she said. "They said they'd want an answer by end of November." 6 weeks. "Okay," she said. "Then let's see what we can figure out in 6 weeks." On the way back to the garage, she called Frank Caruso. Not to ask for anything yet, just to tell him the way you tell someone who matters that something is moving in a direction you're watching. Frank listened without interrupting, which was his habit, and when she finished, he said, "You need anything right now?" "Not right now," she said, "but I might." "Then you know where I am," he said, and that was the whole call. What Claire did next was the thing that Ethan would remember longest when he looked back on this period, longer than the harvest. Day confrontation. Longer than Frank's handshake, longer than any of the moments that had been louder and more visible. She sat down with a notebook and she started writing down names. Not names of people who owed her favors, not names of people she could leverage. Names of people who cared about the garage the way she cared about it for their own reasons because of their own histories with the place and with what it represented. Bobby Marsh, who'd brought every vehicle he'd owned for 15 years to that address, and whose father had brought vehicles there before him. Ray's neighbor, Connie Sherwood, who'd learned to change her own oil under Claire's instruction when her ex-husband stopped being the person who handled those things. The high school auto program, for which the garage was both a resource and a proof of concept that mechanical knowledge was still worth having. The volunteer fire department, which used Claire's shop for minor repairs on the department truck because she did it for cost and never made them wait. She spent 3 evenings making calls, not asking for anything specific, telling people what was happening and letting them respond. The responses were not small. By the end of the first week after Ray's second call, 7 people had independently reached out to the Silver Creek Town Council to express concern about commercial development on that corner. Donna Briggs, who worked at the county assessor's office, pulled the zoning records and found 3 discrepancies in the preliminary development proposal that Meridian had apparently already filed, which meant they had been planning this longer than the phone call suggested, which meant this was not an opportunistic offer, but a targeted one. Ethan found that out on a Wednesday afternoon when Donna walked into the garage with a manila folder and said, "Claire, I think you need to see this." And Claire opened the folder and went very still in the way she went still when something had just confirmed a thing she'd already suspected but hadn't wanted to be sure of. "They filed this 6 weeks ago," Claire said. 8, Donna said. "I went back further. 8 weeks, 2 weeks before the first phone call to Ray, which meant they'd done the research, identified the property, filed the preliminary paperwork, and then called Ray in that order. The call hadn't been exploratory. It had been the last step in a process that was already well underway. Ethan looked at the filing date and felt something cold and specific settle in him. "They expected him to sell," he said. "People usually do," Donna said, "when the number's right." Claire closed the folder. She handed it back to Donna and said, "Can you make me a copy of the relevant pages?" "Already did," Donna said, and produced a second folder from under her arm. Duh. The town council meeting was not supposed to be about Morgan's garage. It was the regular monthly session scheduled for the second Thursday of October, and the agenda had parking ordinance updates and a budget discussion about the water treatment facility and a presentation from the county library about expanded hours. The kind of agenda that produces a room with 12 people in it and gets done in 90 minutes. That night, there were 43 people in the council chamber. Ethan counted. He was sitting in the 3rd row with Bobby Marsh on one side and Marcus Webb on the other, which was a combination that would have been inconceivable to him 6 weeks earlier and which now felt simply like where he was supposed to be. Claire was in the front row with Ray Dunbar beside her and Donna Briggs on his other side. She hadn't organized this. She'd made calls and laid out facts and let people decide what those facts meant to them. The 42 other people in the room had decided independently to show up, which was a different and more powerful thing than being asked. The council members looked at the crowd when they came in and looked at each other with the expression of people who have just discovered that tonight's meeting is not the meeting they prepared for. The parking ordinance discussion took 11 minutes. Then the council chair, a woman named Patricia Huang, who'd held the seat for 6 years and knew Silver Creek the way, a place you've chosen to make your permanent home rather than just ended up in, said, I understand there are community members who'd like to address the issue of the Meridian Property Holdings inquiry regarding the 1411 Main Street parcel. I'm going to open the floor. 13 people spoke. They were not all smooth. Some of them were nervous and said things in the wrong order and had to backtrack. Ray Dunbar's hands were shaking slightly when he stood up and said that he hadn't made any decisions and wasn't going to be rushed into any, and that he thought the town deserved to know what was being proposed for that corner before it was a done deal rather than after. Bobby Marsh talked about what it meant to have a mechanic in town who knew your vehicle and knew your family and whose first question was never what's your budget. Connie Sherwood talked about the Saturday 2 years ago when her brake line failed 3 blocks from the garage and Claire had fixed it in 40 minutes and sent her home without charging her because it was a small job and Connie was between paychecks. Marcus Webb, who was 17 and hadn't planned to speak, stood up at the end and said in the slightly too fast cadence of someone who's made a decision before they lose their nerve, "I want to be a mechanic. I've wanted that since I was 12. And the reason I actually think I can do it is because I have somewhere to learn. If that garage closes, I don't have that anymore and there's not another one." He sat back down and looked at his shoes. Claire did not speak. She sat in the front row and listened to every person who stood up, and her face was the face of someone absorbing something they didn't know how to hold yet. Ethan watched her from the third row. He'd thought about speaking. He'd prepared something in his head on the drive over. But sitting in that room and watching the people around him, he understood that the most useful thing he could do tonight was listen. He'd been a very poor listener for a long time. He was practicing. Patricia Huang thanked the speakers and said the council would be requesting documentation from Meridian regarding the zoning discrepancies Donna Briggs had identified and that any development proposal for that address would go through the full public comment process and that she wanted to be on record, saying that the council took long-standing community businesses seriously as part of the town's character and not just its tax base. It wasn't a victory, it wasn't a guarantee, but it was the sound of a door that had been moving toward close, stopping, and reconsidering its direction. After the meeting, standing on the sidewalk outside the council building, in the cold October air, Frank Caruso appeared. He hadn't been inside. Ethan hadn't seen him arrive. But he was there on the sidewalk when people came out, his hands in his jacket pockets, and when Claire saw him, she stopped walking and said, "You came." "Heard there was a meeting," Frank said. "You drove 2 hours for a town council meeting." "I drove 2 hours because it mattered to you." He looked around at the people filing out. "Looks like it mattered to a few others too." "I didn't ask them to come," she said. "I know, that's the point." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across the street on Harvest Day, not with sentiment exactly, but with the kind of regard that has depth behind it, that has history and grief and time. James would have liked this, the whole thing. He always said you were better at community than you gave yourself credit for. Claire was quiet for a moment. "Do that to me in a parking lot, Frank." "Fair enough," he said, and his voice had that brief warmth in it again. Ethan was standing 10 feet away and heard all of it and looked away to give them the privacy of the moment while staying close enough to be present. He was learning about that too, the difference between being there for someone and being in the way of something. Bobby Marsh appeared at his shoulder and said, "You speak tonight." "No," Ethan said. "Good call," Bobby said without elaboration, and Ethan understood that he meant it as a compliment. 3 days after the council meeting, someone spray-painted the words "Go home" on the wall of Morgan's garage facing the side alley. Not subtle, not ambiguous. 2 words in black paint on the brick visible from the street if you came down from the north, which was the direction the school bus ran. Claire saw it at 6:45 in the morning when she arrived to open up. She stood looking at it for approximately 30 seconds. Then she went inside, made coffee, and called the Silver Creek Police Department to report vandalism, giving them the details in the same tone she used to order parts, factual, specific, without dramatics. The officer who came, a young woman named Tess Garfield, who joined the department 8 months ago and who already had enormous respect for Claire because Claire had helped her get her personal vehicle running again after a bad repair job from a shop in the next county. Officer Garfield photographed the wall, took the report, and said she'd checked the business cameras from the adjacent buildings. After she left, Ethan showed up, as he did most mornings now, and stopped dead when he saw the wall. His face did something that Claire watched without comment. "When?" he said. "Overnight," she said. Come inside, coffee's on. He followed her in, but he kept looking back at the wall through the open bay door. This is because of the council meeting, he said, probably. They're trying to scare you. Yes. Are they? She poured 2 cups and handed him one. No, she said, but they don't know that yet. He wrapped both hands around the mug. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, what do you need me to do? She looked at him over her own cup. The question was so different from everything he'd been when he walked into this garage 6 weeks ago that she took a second to let it land properly. You can help me paint the wall this afternoon, she said. I've got primer in the back. That's it. That's it for now. He nodded. Then Bobby Marsh walked in, saw the look on both their faces and said, I heard. I've got paint rollers in my truck. He set a paper bag on the workbench. Also brought donuts because you both look like you haven't eaten. And then impossibly Claire laughed. Not a big laugh, but a real one, and it broke something in the room that had needed breaking, and Ethan found himself laughing too, which he wouldn't have been able to predict or explain, but which felt like the right response to the moment, in the way that sometimes laughter is the only thing that fits. Bum. The wall got painted that afternoon. 4 people showed up who hadn't been called. Word traveled in Silver Creek the way water traveled downhill, finding every available channel. Danny Reyes came on his day off. Connie Sherwood brought her teenage son. Marcus Webb appeared with a paint tray and no explanation. They covered the wall in 2 hours. When they were done, you couldn't tell anything had ever been written there. Ethan stayed until it was finished. He rolled paint with the same focused efficiency he brought to the heavy bag, and he didn't say much, and at one point Bobby Marsh looked over at him from the adjacent section of wall and said quietly enough that only Ethan could hear it, "You're doing good, son." It was such a small thing. 2 words, 4 letters total, the kind of offhand acknowledgement that men sometimes give each other in the middle of work when they want to say something true without making a moment of it. Ethan felt it go somewhere deep and stay. I thought about what Frank Caruso had said about James Morgan, about being able to take a hit and decide what it meant. He thought about Claire standing in front of him on Main Street with her back to 30 motorcycles, not scared, not performing. He thought about Marcus Webb at the council meeting, standing up too fast and talking too quickly, and sitting down and looking at his shoes. I thought about the belt around his waist at last year's championship, how it had felt like the truest thing about him, and how somewhere in the last 6 weeks it had started to feel like a credential from a test he'd outgrown. Not because the skill wasn't real. The skill was real. He'd earned it honestly. But a belt told you what you could do in conditions that were designed for that belt. It told you nothing about what you did when someone spray painted your wall at 3 in the morning, when a corporation came for the thing that held your community together, when a 17-year-old kid stood up in a council meeting with shaking hands because he needed someone to know that the thing being threatened was the thing that made his future feel possible. Those situations didn't have weight classes. They didn't have referees. He went home that evening and took the belt down from where he'd hung it on the wall of his old bedroom and put it in his equipment bag where it belonged with the rest of the tools. The following Tuesday, Donna Briggs called Claire with news from the county assessor's office that changed the shape of everything. Meridian didn't just file on your property, Donna said, and her voice had the particular controlled urgency of someone who has been sitting with information that's too big to sit with. They filed on 4 properties, Ray's 1. The other 3 are the Callahan building on 5th, the old Hennessy lot on Route 9, and the parking area behind the farmer's market. Claire said, "Say that again." Donna said it again. The 4 properties together formed a rough rectangle. A rectangle that if developed together would be large enough for a mid-sized commercial complex, the kind with a national grocery anchor, and 3 or 4 chain businesses arranged around a parking lot. The kind of thing that didn't destroy a small town all at once, but changed its gravity permanently. The kind of thing that once built, pulled spending and foot traffic toward itself and away from the Main Street businesses that had been there for decades until those businesses couldn't sustain themselves on what was left. Silver Creek had seen it happen to other towns. Everyone who lived here had watched it happen somewhere near them and told themselves it couldn't happen here. "They've been planning this for longer than 8 weeks, Claire said. "My best guess is 18 months, Donna said. "Maybe 2 years. This is not an opportunistic acquisition. They've been waiting for the right moment on all 4 properties simultaneously." Claire sat down on the stool she kept next to the workbench. She put her free hand flat on the bench the way you put your hand on something solid when you need to feel the solidity. Who owns the other three properties, she said. Donna told her. Two of them were people Claire knew. One was an absentee owner, a family in Portland, who'd inherited the Hennessy lot from a grandfather and had been meaning to do something with it for 10 years without ever quite getting there. The absentee owner, Claire said, that's the one they're counting on. Probably, Donna said. If they get that one and raise, they've got what they need for the anchor parcel. The other two are secondary. Claire sat with for a moment. Then she said, thank you, Donna, I mean that. What are you going to do? I'm going to make a call, she said. She hung up with Donna and sat still for exactly 30 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called Frank Caruso. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting for this call. Tell me, he said. She told him everything. All of it, the four properties, the timeline, the absentee owners in Portland, the rectangle they formed, and what that rectangle was designed to become. When she finished, Frank was quiet for 10 seconds. Then he said, you need the Portland family to hold. Or sell to someone else. Another pause. I might know someone who'd be interested in that lot for the right reasons, he said. Let me make a call. Frank, Claire, don't do anything that creates problems. I never do anything that creates problems, he said in a tone that acknowledged that this was not entirely accurate. I do things that solve them. Give me 24 hours. She put her phone down and looked at the wall in front of her, the freshly painted wall. Toots of exterior gray over the spot where someone had tried to tell her she didn't belong here. She looked at it for a long time. Then Ethan walked in, took one look at her face and said, what happened? She told him that too, all of it. He listened from beginning to end without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, this was never about your garage, was it? You were always going to be in the middle of this, whether you wanted to be or not. Looks that way, she said. Okay. He said it the way you say something when you've made a decision that doesn't require discussion. Then we figure out what's next. She looked at him, this young man who had walked into her garage 6 weeks ago with a championship belt and a chip the size of a mountain range, and had, through a series of collisions he'd mostly caused himself, arrived at something that looked at almost like the person he was actually capable of being. She looked at him and thought about James, who would absolutely have found this entire situation hilarious. And she thought about Frank on the phone saying, give me 24 hours. And she thought about Marcus Webb standing up in a council chamber with shaking hands. Yeah, she said, we do. Outside on Main Street, a delivery truck went past, and somewhere down the block, someone was laughing, and the gray-painted wall held firm, and Silver Creek kept moving through its Tuesday like it always did, ordinary on the surface and underneath, the way things always are underneath in a small town where people have lived long enough to mean something to each other, anything but. Frank's 24 hours turned into 18. He called Claire at 6:40 in the morning, before she'd even unlocked the garage, while she was still sitting in her truck in the parking lot, with a coffee going cold in the cup holder in the gray light of an early Montana morning, pressing in from every direction. The Portland family, said without preamble. Their name is Kowalski. The grandfather who owned the Hennessy lot was a man named Gerald Kowalski, died 4 years ago. Left it to his son David and David's 2 sisters. David's the one who handles it. He's 53, works in tech, has approximately 0 emotional connection to a piece of Montana land he's driven past exactly twice in his life. How do you know all that? Claire said. Because I spent 18 hours on the phone with people who know people, Frank said. I've been doing this for 30 years, Claire. I know people in every state west of the Mississippi. Did you talk to David Kowalski directly? Not yet, but here's what I know. Meridian made him an offer 60 days ago. He hasn't signed. His sisters are the reason. One of them, the youngest, spent summers in Silver Creek as a kid. She has feelings about what happens to the lot. She's been the holdout. Claire sat up straighter. What's her name? Patrice. Patrice Kowalski Reeves now lives in Spokane. She's the one you need to talk to. How do I reach her? Frank recited a phone number from memory. Then he said, Claire, she doesn't know who you are yet. Lead with Gerald, not with the property. She loved her grandfather. That's the door. Claire wrote the number on the back of a receipt she pulled from her center console. Her handwriting was steady. What are you not telling me? She said, a pause that was 1 beat too long. Meridian's timeline moved up, he said. I don't know how or why, but David Kowalski has apparently agreed to a meeting with their acquisition team next Friday. In person, in Denver. 6 days. Okay, Claire said, Her voice was level in the way it was always level when things were moving faster than she wanted them to. I'll call Patrice today. One more thing. Frank paused again, and this pause had something different in it, heavier. The person running Meridian's acquisitions division, his name is Carter Voss. He's 37, went to Wharton, has a track record of 17 successful small market commercial conversions in the last 6 years. He's good at this, Claire. He finds the weak point in every property arrangement, and he applies exactly the right pressure in exactly the right place. With Ray, that's age and financial security. With David Kowalski, that's indifference. He's not going to make mistakes. Then we can't afford to either, she said. She ended the call and sat in the truck for 30 more seconds. Then she picked up her phone and dialed Patrice Kowalski Reeves. Patrice answered like someone who'd been awake for a while, her voice alert and slightly guarded in the way people are when an unknown number calls before 7 in the morning. Claire introduced herself, her name, Silver Creek, the garage on Main Street, and waited to see which way it would land. Silver Creek, Patrice said. I know Silver Creek. Your grandfather's property is on Route 9, Claire said. The Hennessy lot. I'm a neighbor in the practical sense. My garage has been on the main strip for 4 years. A short silence. Gerald's lot, Patrice said, and the shift in her voice when she said his name was exactly what Frank had told Claire to listen for, the shift that meant this was not an abstract piece of real estate. Yes, Claire said. I'm calling because I think you deserve to know what's being proposed for that lot and for the properties around it before your brother meets with Meridian Property Holdings next Friday. Another silence longer. How do you know about that meeting? I know a lot of people, Claire said simply. Will you give me 20 minutes? Patrice gave her 45. By the time Claire got off the phone, her coffee was completely cold and she didn't care. She sat in the truck for a moment with the phone in her lap and the receipt with Patrice's number in her other hand, and she felt something that was not quite hope. Hope was too light a word for what this situation required, but something in the family of hope. The thing that sits next to hope and looks like it from certain angles. Then she got out of the truck and unlocked the garage and started the day. Ethan arrived at 8 earlier than usual, and she knew from the way he came through the door, purposeful, no coffee in his hand, which meant he hadn't stopped at the diner that he'd been thinking since they'd last spoken and had arrived at something. Tell me what I can do, he said. She looked at him. You know people in Billings, she said, from competition, coaches, gym owners, people who've been around that scene for a long time. Yeah, Meridian has an office in Billings. Carter Voss, the acquisition director, is based there. I need to know who he is beyond what's on a company website, what he's actually like, who he's connected to, whether there's anything about the way he operates that I'm not seeing. Ethan thought about it. My coach Dale Purcell has been in Billings for 25 years. He knows everyone. If Voss has any kind of local footprint, Dale will have heard something. Can you call him today? I'll call him right now. He stepped outside to make the call. Claire started the first job of the day, a routine oil change on Connie Sherwood's Subaru, but she was running on a different track. Her hands doing the work while her mind ran the situation from every angle, testing it the way you test a structure you're about to put weight on, looking for the points where it might give. Ethan came back in 11 minutes. His face had something in it she hadn't seen before, a kind of controlled alarm. Dale knows Voss, he said, not personally but by reputation. Voss was involved in a similar project in Laurel 4 years ago. Small commercial corridor, 3 family-owned properties. He got 2 of the 3 owners to sell. The third one held out, and Dale said he stopped. Say it, Claire said. Dale said that after the third owner refused, there were problems. Nothing that could be connected to Voss directly. Lease complications, a zoning complaint that turned out to be baseless, a contractor, suddenly unavailable for scheduled repairs. Small things, consistent things, over about 6 months. The garage was very quiet. He applies pressure below the line, Claire said. That's what Dale said. Below the line were his exact words. She set down the oil filter wrench. She thought about the spray paint on the wall. She thought about the timeline of Meridian's filings, 18 months of preparation before a single phone call. She thought about Ray Dunbar's shaking hands. We need Ray to talk to a lawyer, she said. Today, if possible. Someone who can look at the offer documents and tell him exactly what he's signing and what he isn't. You know anyone? I know someone in Missoula. She does property law. I'll call her this morning. Claire picked up the wrench again and finished the oil filter with 3 precise turns. And we need to move faster than Voss expects us to. He's counting on this taking the shape he planned. We changed the shape. Sodium. The lawyer's name was Sandra Okafor. She was 51, had been practicing property law in Montana for 22 years, and had a voice on the phone that was brisk and exact, the voice of someone who didn't have time for any part of a conversation that wasn't the relevant part. Claire explained the situation in 8 minutes. Sandra asked 4 questions, all precise, then said, "They get me the offer documents and the preliminary development filing from the county assessor. I'll review over the weekend and have a call with Mr. Dunbar Monday morning. Will you come to Silver Creek?" Claire said. A pause. Why? Because I want Ray to look at you when you explain this to him. He's 71 and he's being targeted by people who are better at this than he is. And I think having a real person in the room will matter more than a phone call. Another pause, slightly longer. Then Sandra said, "I can be there Tuesday." Claire thanked her and hung up and immediately texted Donna Briggs to send the county filing to Sandra's email. Then she did the thing that had been sitting at the back of her mind since Frank's call, the thing she'd been moving around without addressing directly, because addressing it directly meant accepting a dimension of this situation she didn't want to accept. She called Officer Tess Garfield. "The spray paint," she said when Tess picked it up. "Did you pull anything from the neighboring cameras?" "I was going to call you about that today," Tess said. "Yes and no. One camera from the hardware store caught a partial dark-colored late-model truck Montana plates, but the angle didn't catch the plate number. What I did get was the timestamp, 2:17 in the morning, 3 days after the council meeting." 2:17, Claire repeated. "The thing is," Tess said, and her voice dropped into a different register, careful and deliberate. "I ran the timing against when Meridian's team was in the county for site assessments. They had a contractor in Silver Creek 2 days before the council meeting, staying at the motel on Route 9. Claire said nothing. "I can't make a connection," Tess said. "I want to be honest with you about that. What I have is a coincidence in a partial plate. That's not evidence of anything." "But you're telling me," Claire said. "I'm telling you," Tess confirmed, "because you should know the shape of what might be happening even if I can't prove the shape yet." After she hung up, Claire sat on the stool by the workbench and put her hands flat on her thighs and breathed evenly for 30 seconds. She was doing the thing she'd learned to do years ago in a different life when the situation was moving faster than comfort allowed. She was letting herself feel exactly how serious this was without letting that seriousness become panic. Panic burned information. She needed everything she knew right now accessible and clear. The garage door opened and Bobby Marsh came in, not for a repair. Just Bobby being Bobby, showing up because he'd heard in the way the town heard things that the situation had developed, and he wanted to be where the situation was. He looked at her face and said, "How bad?" "Bad enough," she said. "Not unsurvivable." "What do you need?" "Right now I need someone to cover the phones for an hour while I drive out and talk to Ray in person." Bobby sat down in his chair. "Phones are covered," he said, "man. Ray Dunbar's kitchen table had become, over the past 2 weeks, the room where the most important conversations in Silver Creek were happening. Claire sat across from him with the offer documents spread between them and walked him through what Sandra Okafor had said on the preliminary review, the clauses that looked standard and weren't the timeline acceleration buried in paragraph 7, the provision that would restrict Ray from selling to any other buyer for 18 months if he declined after a certain date. Ray was quiet through most of it. He was a man who processed things internally and completely before he responded, which was one of the reasons Claire trusted him. When she finished, he said, "They built a trap." In the documents, yeah. If you're not reading carefully or if you're reading with the assumption that the other side is dealing fairly, you wouldn't catch it. "The 18-month restriction," he said, "means if you say no, you can't sell to anyone else until next November, which puts pressure on your financial situation without them having to do anything else." Ray looked at his hands on the table. "And the spray paint." "I can't prove anything," she said, "but I think you should know the full picture." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised her. "Claire, do you want to buy the building?" She looked at him. "I know you don't have that kind of money," he said before she could speak. "I'm not asking if you can do it today. I'm asking if it's something you'd want if it were possible." She thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "Yes," she said. Ray nodded slowly. Then let's figure out if it's possible, he said, before I let someone else tell me what my options are. That was the moment. She felt it the way you feel a shift in weight when something that's been off balance finally finds its center. Not solved, not finished, but oriented, pointing in the right direction. Sandra Okafor is coming Tuesday, Claire said. Good, Ray said. I'll make lunch. The week that followed moved at two speeds simultaneously agonizingly slow. In the parts where they were waiting for information and brutally fast, in the parts where decisions were accumulating faster than anyone had planned for. Patrice Kowalski-Reeves drove down from Spokane on Thursday. She was 50, had her grandfather's eyes and a narrower face, and she walked into Morgan's garage and looked around with an expression that was taking inventory of something more than the equipment. I used to bring his truck here, she said. Gerald, I came with him once when I was 12. Before my time, Claire said. But the Dunbar family has owned this building that long. Good chance your grandfather sat in the same chair you'll be sitting in. She showed Patrice the development plans. She showed her the rectangle the four properties formed and what filled in that rectangle in Meridian's portfolio of prior projects, the parking lots and chain facades, and the particular deadness that settled over a main street after its gravity had been permanently redirected. Patrice looked at the plans for a long time without speaking. Then she said, David doesn't see it this way. I know, Claire said. He sees a number. He's not a bad person. He's just... She stopped. He doesn't have the 12-year-old's memory, Claire said, without judgment. Patrice looked at her. No, she said. He doesn't. She folded the plans closed. I can delay the meeting. I have that leverage with David. He won't move without my agreement, not because he feels bound to, but because he doesn't want the family conflict. I can buy you time. How much? 2 weeks, maybe 3. That's enough, Claire said, and she believed it when she said it. Sandra Okafor arrived Tuesday morning in a car that was newer and cleaner than anything else on Ray's street and walked into his kitchen with a briefcase and the focused efficiency of someone who had already read everything twice and formed her opinions and was here to deliver them, not develop them. She shook Ray's hand, accepted coffee, declined the offer of pie, and opened her briefcase. Ethan was there too. Claire had brought him, which surprised Ray slightly, but Claire had simply said, he should hear this. And Ray had set out another cup. Sandra spent 40 minutes laying out exactly what the offer documents said, beneath what they appeared to say. She used plain language, which was a skill, and she didn't soften the parts that needed to be hard. She told Ray what his actual options were, including options that Meridian's documents were structured to obscure. When she finished, Ray said, So I can countersell. Yes, Sandra said. The restriction clause doesn't activate unless you formally decline in writing. You haven't done that. You're currently in a state of ongoing consideration, which means your options are completely open, including selling to someone else at a different price, including that, at whatever price you and a willing buyer agree to. Ray looked at Claire. We talked about this, he said. We did, she said. Sandra looked between them. Is there a buyer being discussed? Potentially, Claire said. I need to understand the financing landscape. What does a community land trust structure look like in Montana, and is it feasible in this timeline? Sandra leaned back. You've done some reading. Some, Claire said. A community land trust would allow the property to be held by a nonprofit entity for community benefit. It removes it from the speculative market permanently. The financing can come from multiple sources: community fundraising, CDFI lending, state rural development funds. Sandra paused. It's not a quick process, typically. What if we made it quick, Claire said. How quick? 3 weeks. Sandra looked at her for a long moment. That's not quick, she said. That's a miracle. I've seen a few of those, Claire said. Sandra looked at her briefcase. She looked at Ray. She looked back at Claire. Tell me what you have, she said. What Claire had was Frank Caruso. She'd held that information back from Sandra until she needed to use it, not because she didn't trust Sandra, but because she'd wanted Sandra to assess the situation independently, first without the variable of what Frank represented changing the shape of the analysis. She called Frank from Ray's driveway while Sandra was inside going through documents with Ray. I need to know if the chapter has liquidity, she said. It was a direct question, and she hated asking it, but she asked it directly anyway, because that was the only way to ask it. Frank was quiet for 3 seconds. Claire, I know, she said. I know what I'm asking. You're asking if we'd put money into a land trust for a piece of property in Silver Creek, Montana. I'm asking if the chapter would consider it as an investment with community benefit in a town where the chapter has history. She paused. Where James had history. A longer silence. That's not a decision I make alone, Frank said. I know. I'd have to bring it to the table. I know that too. Give me 48 hours, he said. I have 3 weeks. Then give me 48 hours, he said again. And this time it was not a negotiating position. It was the statement of a man who needed 48 hours. She went back inside. Ethan was still at Ray's table when Sandra left at 1 in the afternoon, and he'd barely spoken the entire time, which for the old Ethan would have been uncharacterizable. The new Ethan, and he was aware enough now to think of himself in those terms, old and new. The version before the garage, and the version that was being assembled inside it, understood that his job in this room was to absorb, not to perform. When it was just the two of them left, Ray having gone to lie down for an hour because the morning had been a lot, Ethan looked at Claire and said, "You've been planning this longer than this week." She was stacking the document copies Sandra had left. "What makes you say that?" "The land trust question. That wasn't something you came up with after Donna called. You knew what a community land trust was before any of this started." She stopped stacking. She looked at him with an expression that acknowledged he'd seen something real. "When I came to Silver Creek 4 years ago," she said, "I knew I was in a rented space. I've been in rented spaces before. You learn quickly that a rented space is only ever as secure as the landlord's circumstances. Ray has been solid, but Ray is 71. She paused. "I looked into land trust structures about 2 years ago. I looked into what it would take. I set it aside because the timing wasn't there, and because I didn't want to have the conversation with Ray that would require me to explain why I was thinking about it." "You'd been afraid of asking," Ethan said. "I'd been afraid of what asking might tell him about how little I trusted the security of the arrangement," she said, "even though Ray has never given me a reason not to trust him." "So Meridian did you a favor," he said carefully. She considered that for a moment. "In the same way a house fire does you the favor of showing you exactly which relationships are fireproof," she said. "I didn't need the fire, but now that it's here, you know what you've got," he said. She nodded once. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something he hadn't said to anyone except his mother and his coach in his entire adult life. "I want to put in money," he said, "to the land trust, whatever I can put in." She looked at him. "I've got savings," he said. "From the competition circuit, I've been winning prize money since I was 19, and I've never spent much because I was always focused on the next competition and not on anything else. It's not a huge amount, but it's real." "Ethan, I live in this town," he said. "Right now I live here. And even if I leave, which I might, I don't know yet, I want the town I lived in to be the town I actually lived in. Not a strip mall." He held her gaze. "Let me be part of this." She looked at him for a long time. The same look she'd had in the garage weeks ago when he'd first asked what he could do. The look of something recalibrating. "Talk to Sandra before you commit anything," she said. "Make sure you understand exactly what the structure is." "I will," he said. "And Ethan?" She paused. "Thank you." He nodded. He didn't make it more than it was. That was new too. Frank called back in 36 hours instead of 48. "The table voted," he said. Claire's hand tightened on the phone. "And unanimous," he said. She closed her eyes. 1 second too. "Frank. James would have wanted this," Frank said. "Everyone at the table knew it. That's all I had to say." She didn't speak for a moment because speaking required having your voice under control, and she was working on that. "How much?" she said finally. He told her. It was enough, combined with Ray's willingness to deed the property to a land trust at below market value, which Sandra had already confirmed was legally structured with the tax benefits properly allocated, and the amount Ethan was putting in the county rural development funds. Sandra had identified it was enough. Not by a lot, by exactly enough, which was its own kind of answer. Carter Voss called Ray Dunbar on Thursday morning, expecting an answer, and got something he hadn't planned for. Ray said, "I'm not selling to Meridian. I've been in contact with an attorney, and I'm pursuing an alternative disposition of the property that I believe is more consistent with the community interests this land has served for 30 years. A silence on the line. Then Voss said in the smooth, controlled voice of a man who pivots without breaking, "I'd encourage you to think carefully about that, Mr. Dunbar. Our offer represents—" "I've thought carefully," Ray said. "I've had professional legal counsel and adequate time. My decision is final." Another silence. "I hope you're not making this decision under pressure from outside parties," Voss said. And the sentence was shaped in a way that was designed to sound like concern, but was actually a probe trying to determine whether Ray's decision had a weak point that could be addressed. Ray said, "My decisions have never been made under pressure from outside parties. That's something Meridian Property Holdings might find useful to understand." And he hung up. He told Claire about the call that afternoon. When he got to the part where he'd hung up, Claire said, "Ray." "What?" he said. "That was beautifully done." He looked slightly pleased in the way that people look when they've done something that turned out to be harder than they expected and came out the other side intact. "I've been in this town for 71 years, he said. "I know how to end a phone call." Ethan, who was sitting in his by-now customary spot on the workbench, made a sound that was mostly laugh. Bobby Marsh in his chair by the door shook his head slowly with an expression of deep approval. The Hennessy lot situation resolved 2 days later, when Patrice Kowalski-Reeves called Claire to say that she'd spoken to David for 4 hours the previous evening and had walked him through everything: the development plans, the real shape of the rectangle, the what happened next for towns where Meridian had built, and that David, who was not a bad person, but had been operating with incomplete information, had agreed to take the lot off the market for a minimum of 1 year while alternatives were explored. "I wants to do something with it that Grandpa would have understood," Patrice said. "He doesn't know what yet, but he's not selling to Meridian." "That's enough for now," Claire said. "Claire," Patrice said, "thank you for calling me. Thank you for answering." The land trust paperwork took 17 days. Sandra worked at a pace that she later described as unprecedented in her experience, powered by a combination of genuine interest in the case and the specific kind of energy that comes from watching a community organize itself in real time around something that matters. The day the documents were signed, Ray, Claire, Sandra, and 2 board members from the County Rural Development Office at Ray's kitchen table, with the same cold coffee energy that seemed to accompany every significant event in this story. The garage at 1411 Main Street formally ceased to be a piece of speculative real estate and became, in the language of the trust documents, a community-held property designated for ongoing small business use in perpetuity. In perpetuity. Claire read that word twice. In the document, it was just a legal term. In the room, with Ray's hand still on the pen and Sandra closing her briefcase and the sound of someone's car going past on the street outside, it was something else entirely. Ethan drove to Billings that weekend and came back with a check made out to the Silver Creek Community Land Trust, signed in his careful block handwriting, and handed it to Sandra without ceremony. She took it with the same efficiency she applied to everything and said, "This process is Monday." "Good to know," he said. He drove to his mother's house and sat at her kitchen table, which was where he sat when he had something he was working through, and she brought him coffee without asking and sat across from him and said, "You look different." Different how she considered him the way mothers consider the people their children have become. "Like yourself," she said, "but more of it." He didn't have a response for that, which meant it had landed somewhere true. Outside the window, Silver Creek was doing what it did on a Saturday, ordinary and specific and irreducibly itself. The kind of ordinary that you only understand the value of after you've watched someone try to take it apart and seen how many hands reached out to hold it together. The garage was still on the corner. The freshly painted wall was holding. Ray's kitchen table had dried coffee rings on it from 17 days of meetings, and the Harvest Day booth for the fire department was already being planned for next year, and Marcus Webb had asked Claire if he could start coming in on Saturdays to learn, and she'd said yes. And somewhere in the quiet of all that, Ethan Caldwell was becoming someone he hadn't known how to be 6 weeks ago, not because he'd been forced to, not because he'd lost something, but because he'd finally walked into a room that was bigger than his belt and stayed long enough to find out what fit inside it. The next chapter of this was already beginning in the specific way that things in small towns begin, not with announcements, but with the accumulation of ordinary days that are quietly building towards something none of the people living them have quite named yet. The first Saturday Marcus Webb came in to learn, he broke a socket wrench within 20 minutes. Not because he was careless, because he was trying too hard, applying force in the wrong direction with the confidence of someone who had watched enough videos to believe they understood a physical thing before their hands actually did. The wrench snapped at the handle joint with a sound like a small gunshot, and Marcus went completely still and looked at Claire with the expression of a person who has just destroyed someone else's property and is waiting to find out the consequences. Claire looked at the wrench. She looked at Marcus. She said, "That's a $20 tool. You just learned a $40 lesson about counterclockwise. We're ahead." Marcus let out a breath that had been sitting in his chest since the snap. "I'll pay for it," he said immediately. "You'll pay for it by not breaking the next one," she said. "Pick up the torque wrench on the second shelf and I'll show you the difference between force and leverage." Ethan was in the corner working on a carburetor rebuild that Claire had asked him to handle while she supervised Marcus, and he heard the whole exchange without looking up. He kept his eyes on the carburetor and kept his hands moving, but something in him registered the lesson. Not the mechanical one, the other one with a specificity that would have been foreign to him 3 months ago. I thought about every time he'd applied force in the wrong direction and mistaken the resulting damage for proof of his own power. He thought about Main Street in October, his hands up Claire's back to him. He thought about what force actually was and what leverage actually was and how long it had taken him to understand the difference. The carburetor came apart cleanly in his hands, and he set the pieces out on the clean cloth in the correct order and went to the next step without having to think about the sequence. And that automatic knowledge earned through repetition, through showing up, through hours of work that nobody had watched, felt more like something than any trophy he'd ever lifted. November came into Silver Creek cold and fast, the way it always did in the mountains, and with it came a particular quality of stillness that settled over the town after the land trust signing. Not the stillness of resolution. Things were still moving, still uncertain in the ways that things in small towns were always uncertain, but the stillness of a situation that had found its balance point, at least for now. Meridian Property Holdings had not called Ray again. Carter Voss had not reappeared. The Hennessy lot sat quiet and untroubled while the Kowalski siblings figured out what Gerald would have wanted, and the Callahan building and the farmer's market parking lot had both had conversations with Sandra Okafor that were ongoing and that Sandra described as promising, which in Sandra's vocabulary meant something close to certain. The garage was busy. It was always busy in November when people were getting vehicles ready for winter: snow tires, antifreeze, brake inspections, heaters that had been quietly failing since March and couldn't be ignored anymore. Claire worked 6 days a week and Danny Reyes worked 4, and Marcus came in on Saturdays with the focused intensity of someone who has found the thing they were looking for and intends not to lose it. Ethan came in most mornings. He'd stopped explaining his presence, which was its own kind of shift. In the beginning, he'd always had a reason: the borrowed tool, a question, an errand that could plausibly justify being in a place he hadn't been invited to. Now he came because he was part of what happened there, and both he and Claire understood it, and the understanding didn't require articulation. He trained in the evenings at Frontier Fitness instead of the mornings. The shift had happened naturally following the shape of what the days had become, and nobody had commented on it. He still worked the heavy bag with the same intensity. He still ran combinations that were clean and fast and built on a decade of real discipline. But the energy behind them had changed source. He wasn't training to prove something to a room full of people who hadn't asked for proof. I was training because the physical work was part of how he functioned, part of how he processed and maintained and stayed clear the way some people ran or cooked or played music. It belonged to him. It just didn't have to belong to everyone else's attention anymore. Davis noticed most things. He said one evening, wrapping his hands beside Ethan before their sparring session, "You're better." "I've been training hard," Ethan said. "Not harder," Davis said. "Better. There's a difference." Ethan thought about Claire saying that to him about force and leverage, about what he'd just heard her say to Marcus that morning. He thought about how the same lesson kept appearing in different languages. "Yeah," he said, "I know." The thing nobody had anticipated came on a Wednesday, the second week of November, when a man walked into Morgan's garage at 2 in the afternoon who nobody recognized. He was 60, well-dressed in the way that read as money without trying to announce it. Good boots, a jacket that fit right, the kind of haircut that got maintained regularly. He looked at the garage with the assessing eyes of someone who looked at things for a living, and he said to Claire, "Are you the owner?" I'm the operator, she said. The property is held by a community land trust. What can I do for you? He looked at her for a moment, recalibrating something. My name is Gerald Marsh, he said. Bobby Marsh's head came up from the chair by the door so fast it was audible. I'm Bobby's brother, the man said, looking at Bobby with an expression that had something complicated in it. I've been in Portland for 22 years. I'm back for, he stopped. I heard what happened here. With the Meridian situation, Bobby called me. Bobby Marsh, who was 50 years old and had spent most of his adult life in Silver Creek, while his brother had spent most of his adult life somewhere else, looked at Gerald with an expression that was working through several things at once. I didn't expect you to come down, Bobby said. I know, Gerald said. He looked back at Claire. I have a background in commercial real estate litigation. I spent 15 years in Portland fighting exactly the kind of acquisition strategy Meridian uses. I know Carter Voss not personally, but I know his playbook better than most people outside his company. He paused. I don't know if you still need help. Bobby said the land trust is done. The land trust for this property is done, Claire said carefully. There are two others still in conversation. Gerald Marsh looked at her. Then you still need help, he said. The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds and had a very specific texture, the texture of a room. Recalibrating around new information, testing its weight, figuring out where to put it. Ethan, who was in the back working on a truck differential and had heard the whole exchange through the open bay door, came to the doorway and stood there without coming fully in. He looked at Bobby. Bobby looked at his brother looked at Claire. Claire said, why? It was one word, and it was the right word, and Gerald Marsh heard what it was really asking. Not why are you here, but why would you do this? Why now? Why for a town you haven't lived in for 22 years? Why for people who aren't asking you? Gerald was quiet for a moment. Because Bobby called me, he said again, and then he stopped and started differently. No, that's the occasion, not the reason. He looked at his hands briefly. I left Silver Creek when I was 38 because I thought the work I wanted to do required a bigger city. I was right about that, practically speaking. But I've been watching what I thought I was building from a distance for 22 years. And last month, Bobby called me and described what was happening on this street, and I realized he stopped again. What? Claire said. That the community I was supposedly serving in Portland was an abstraction, and the one Bobby was describing was real. He looked around the garage, the equipment, the work orders on the wall, the cleared spaces that showed how much happened here. I know what these corners mean. I grew up watching them disappear everywhere else. I spent 20 years trying to stop it legally, and I know exactly what weapons work and which ones don't. He looked at her directly. The Callahan building and the farmer's market lot, are they still in negotiation? Yes, Claire said. Then let me help. Bobby Marsh said from his chair in the particular tone he used when he was saying something that mattered without making a ceremony of it. He's good, Claire. He's the best at this I've ever seen. Coming from Bobby, who measured words the way other people measured good lumber, only what was necessary. Nothing wasted that was as unambiguous as a written statement. Claire looked at Gerald for a moment longer. Then she said, you know Sandra Okafor. By reputation, she's excellent. She's handling the trust structures. If you're willing to work with her, completely, he said. Then sit down, Claire said. Coffee's on the counter. Tell me what you know about Voss's secondary acquisition strategy when the primary target holds. Gerald Marsh sat down in the second metal chair, the one that didn't have Bobby's permanent impression in it, and for the next 2 hours the garage held a conversation about property law and community rights and the specific tactical patterns of commercial acquisition that was the most unusual thing that had ever happened on that particular piece of Main Street real estate, which was saying something given the last 3 months. Ethan came in from the bay after an hour and sat on the workbench and listened. He didn't know most of the legal vocabulary, and he didn't pretend to, but he understood the structure of what was being discussed, the way pressure was applied and where the leverage points were, and how you held ground when someone else had more resources, because it was the same vocabulary as fighting, just translated into a different language. At one point, Gerald said something about the critical window between an initial refusal and a secondary offer, when most targets feel isolated and reconsidering becomes psychologically available. And Ethan said without thinking, that's exactly when you push someone against the ropes and wait for them to make a mistake. Everyone in the room looked at him. It's the same principle, he said. In competition, you don't have to beat them twice. You beat them once, and then you make them feel like they already lost, so they make the next mistake for you. Gerald Marsh looked at him with genuine interest. That's exactly right, he said. What's your background? Martial arts, Ethan said. He's a three-time regional champion, Bobby said from his chair with the casual pride of someone who has adopted a person's achievements as adjacent to his own. Gerald looked at Ethan with an expression that was recalibrating. Then you understand that defense wins when it makes the other side overextend. Yeah, Ethan said. That's actually the whole thing. Claire watched this exchange with an expression that stayed neutral on the surface and was underneath something that she would not have been able to name cleanly, but that had components of gratitude and wonder. In the particular emotion you feel when you watch people who started as strangers find the shared language that was there the whole time. Alang, Gerald's first move was not a legal one. He called Carter Voss. He did it from Bobby's house in the evening, with Bobby in the kitchen making dinner, and Claire sitting across the table from Gerald with a notepad, and he called the cell number he had for Voss from 3 years ago, a different case, a different town, and waited to see if it still worked. It rang 4 times, then Voss. Carter, Gerald said. Gerald Marsh. It's been a while. A pause, shorter than it should have been, which meant Voss recognized the name immediately and was deciding in real time how to position. Gerald, he said, where are you these days? Silver Creek, Montana, Gerald said. A longer pause. Interesting, Voss said, and his voice had gone very smooth, which was what voices like his did when they were managing information. I thought you'd think so, Gerald said. I'm working with the property owners and community stakeholders on the remaining parcels in your acquisition target area. I wanted to call as a professional courtesy one practitioner to another, so you understood the landscape before committing further resources. I appreciate that, Voss said. His tone said he did not appreciate it at all. The Hennessy lot is off the market for a minimum of 12 months. The Callahan Building ownership is in active conversation with a community development organization that has prior claim on the right of first refusal, which I'm sure your team reviewed in the title search, but I wanted to confirm it's being exercised. Gerald paused. The farmers market parking area has 3 co-owners, 2 of whom have already indicated they're not interested in selling. You need all 3 for the parcel to be usable. You have a window of approximately 2 weeks before one of those co-owners departs for winter and becomes unreachable until March. Claire looked up from her notepad. Gerald hadn't told her this part. What I'm telling you, Carter, Gerald continued, is that the rectangle doesn't work anymore. The anchor parcel is gone. The secondary parcels are fragmenting. You can spend the next 6 months and significant legal resources trying to reconfigure a project that no longer has its foundational geometry, or you can redeploy those resources somewhere else and chalk this one up to a market that moved differently than projected. He paused one more time. I've seen you do both. You make better decisions when someone tells you the truth early. I'm telling you the truth early. Voss was quiet for 5 seconds. Then he said, I'll have my team review the current status. Of course, Gerald said, take your time. And he hung up. Claire said, the farmer's market co-owner, the one who's leaving for winter. Real, Gerald said. Her name is Vera Hutchins. She winters in Arizona. She leaves the 3rd week of November. I found that out this morning. And the right of first refusal on the Callahan building. Gerald looked at her. It will be real by Monday, he said. Sandra and I discussed it this afternoon. It requires 1 filing and the signature of the historical preservation nonprofit that holds adjacent property rights. Sandra has a contact on their board. Claire looked at him for a long moment. You moved all of this today? I moved what was movable today, he said. The rest was already in place. I just described it as if it were further along than it is because Voss doesn't have perfect information, and the cost of checking is time. He may not want to spend on a project that's already generating resistance. Is that legal? Bobby said from the kitchen where he'd been listening while stirring something. I described the direction of movement, not the current position, Gerald said. Everything I said is true as a vector. As a snapshot, it requires some charitable interpretation. He looked at Bobby. Yes, it's legal. Bobby went back to stirring. Just checking, he said. Carter Voss's team submitted a formal withdrawal of the Meridian Acquisition Inquiry to the Silver Creek County Assessor's Office on Friday afternoon. Donna Briggs called Claire at 4:15 to tell her, and her voice had the quality of someone delivering information that they've been hoping to deliver for weeks and are now finding that the moment is both larger and quieter than they expected. "It's done," Claire said. "Filed and time-stamped," Donna said. "All 4 parcels. They withdrew from everything." Claire was standing in the garage when the call came alone. For once, Danny had left at 3, Marcus at 4. Ethan had gone to an early training session. The garage was quiet around her, with the good quiet of a space that was still and full, at the same time the way places feel when they've been worked in long enough to hold something of all the work. She stood with the phone in her hand after she hung up. She didn't call anyone immediately. She stood there for 2 minutes with the information settling into her, finding its shape inside the larger shape of everything that had led to it. Frank's phone calls in the dark, Ray's kitchen table, Donna's manila folder, Marcus's broken socket, wrench, Gerald Marsh walking through the door because his brother had called Ethan coming in from the bay to say that defense wins when it makes the other side overextend. She thought about James. She did this in a specific way, not dwelling, not reopening, but acknowledging the way you acknowledge someone who should have been in the room for something. He would have been here for this. He would have been at Bobby's table when Gerald called Voss, listening with that particular stillness he had when things were moving toward right. And afterward, he would have said something short and exact that named what had happened better than anyone else could. He'd been good at that, better than her, she'd always thought, though he disagreed. She put the phone in her pocket. She picked up the shop rag from the bench, the habit of her hands, and she wiped them, even though they were clean. And then she locked the bay door and turned off the lights and went home. She called Frank from her own kitchen that night. He picked up on the first ring, same as always, and she said, "It's done," and he said, "I know," because Donna Briggs had apparently called someone who had called someone who had called Frank, because that was how information moved in communities that were actually connected. "Thank you," she said, "for the chapter, for the money, for coming to the council meeting when nobody asked you to." "You don't thank family for showing up," Frank said. She was quiet for a moment. "He would have loved this whole thing," she said. "James, he would have laughed for a week." Frank made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him in a long time. "He would have made fun of every single person involved," he said, "in the most affectionate way possible." "Yes," she said, "exactly." "Claire," Frank said, "he'd be proud of you." She let that land. She'd learned over 5 years not to deflect it. "I know," she said. And then, because it was true, "I'm proud of me too." 2 days later, on a Sunday, Ethan drove to his mother's house in the morning and asked her to come with him to the garage. She hadn't been inside before, and he wanted her to see it. She came in on her cane, still 6 weeks from full recovery from the hip surgery, and looked around at the equipment in the workbench, in the work orders, in the radio on the shelf, with an expression of taking inventory. Claire was there. She shook Ethan's mother's hand. Her name was Joan. She had Ethan's jawline and eyes that had seen a lot and kept their kindness anyway, and said, "Your son has good hands. He could do this work." Joan looked at Ethan. "He knows how to do a lot of things," she said in the tone of a mother who was saying something true and also something else simultaneously. "He's learning the harder things," Claire said, "the ones that take longer." Joan looked at Claire for a moment with the particular attention of a woman who is assessing another woman and finding what she finds. "He's different," as she said, "since he came back, since this town." "He did that himself," Claire said. "I just had the garage." Joan made a sound of polite disagreement. "You had more than the garage," she said. Ethan stood between these two women who were talking about him as if he weren't there, which should have been uncomfortable, and was instead something he chose to simply be present for, because being present for things, rather than performing in them, was the work, and the work was ongoing, and he was getting better at it. The winter came fully by the end of November, and Silver Creek went into its particular winter mode, the mode of a mountain town that knows how to be cold, that's been doing this long enough not to be surprised by it. The garage stayed busy. The land trust held its first official board meeting in Ray's kitchen with Ray and Claire, and 2 community members who'd agreed to serve, and Gerald Marsh joined by phone from Portland, where he'd gone back after the Meridian situation resolved, and where he was apparently now in active conversation with Sandra Okafor about a property rights consulting arrangement that had something to do with small Montana towns and community development, though the details were still taking shape. Bobby told Ethan about it at the gym one morning. Ethan listened and said, "Gerald's moving here." "Not here," Bobby said, "but closer. He's looking at Missoula, close enough to work with Sandra's office, and close enough to—" He stopped. "Close enough to what?" Ethan said. Bobby wrapped his hands with the deliberate care he always used buying a second. "Close enough to come for Harvest Day," he said. Ethan looked at him. Bobby looked back. Something passed between them that was about brothers, about the long distances that accumulate between people who grew up in the same house and then lived entirely different lives, and about what it meant when one of those people drove back. "That's good," Ethan said simply. "Yeah," Bobby said. "It is." No. Marcus Webb passed his first real competency check in late November. It wasn't a formal test. There were no formal tests in Morgan's garage because Claire believed competency was demonstrated, not certified, and the demonstration was doing the job correctly and knowing why each step was correct. The check was a full brake job on Bobby Marsh's truck, done start to finish by Marcus, with Claire watching and asking questions, but not touching the work. Marcus got everything right. He stood back from the truck when he was done and looked at it with an expression that Ethan recognized. He'd had the same expression after his first real competition, win the real one. The first year he'd actually believed his body knew what it was doing instead of just executing what his brain was telling it. The expression of a thing clicking into place permanently. "Clean," Claire said. Marcus said nothing. His jaw was tight in the way jaws get tight when you're working very hard not to show how much something means. Bobby Marsh came over and looked at his truck and then looked at Marcus and said, "Good job, son." And those two words did to Marcus what the same two words had done to Ethan in front of a freshly painted wall, which was to find the exact place that needed them and stay. The championship regional circuit sent Ethan his registration forms for the following year in early December. He'd been on their mailing list for 6 years, and every December the forms came, and every December he filled them out immediately, sometimes before he'd even opened the rest of his mail. He looked at the forms for a long time. Then he set them on his desk and left them there for 3 days without filling them out, which was unprecedented. On the 4th day, he picked them up again, and he sat at his desk with them in his hand, and he thought about what competing meant now versus what it had meant before. He thought about Davis Finch saying, "You're better, not harder, better." I thought about what the belt had meant on the wall and what it meant in the equipment bag, and how those were different objects even though they were physically the same thing. He thought about Claire saying he'd never been the man who was actually going to cross the line. He'd been embarrassed and proud and trying to save face. But not that man. He thought about what kind of man he was instead, and what kind he was becoming, and whether the competition circuit was part of that or just habit. He filled out the forms. He was going back, but differently, not to prove himself to rooms full of people who hadn't asked for proof. To do the thing he was genuinely good at in the place it belonged, separate from everything he'd built on top of it that didn't belong. The skill was his. It had always been his. He'd just forgotten for a while that it belonged to him rather than the other way around. He mailed the forms on a Friday and drove to the garage afterward and helped Claire replace a fuel pump on a truck that needed 3 sets of hands, and nobody acknowledged that anything particular had happened that day, which was exactly right. The last significant thing that happened before the year turned was small by the measure of everything that had preceded it, but it was the thing that Ethan would return to longest in the months and years that followed. It was a Saturday. Marcus was in working on a carburetor with the focused patience that had replaced his early anxious overforce. Bobby was in his chair, Danny was in the bay, Claire was at the bench doing an inventory of parts for winter orders. Frank Caruso came through the door. He did it the way he did everything, without announcement, without performing his arrival, just showing up and being there. He nodded at Bobby, looked at Marcus working, and nodded at that too, and walked over to Claire at the bench. She turned and saw him and said, "Frank, you didn't call." "I was passing through," he said. "I wanted to see the wall." She looked at him. "The painted one." "The painted one," he said. They went outside together, just the two of them, and stood on the sidewalk looking at the wall. 2 coats of exterior gray, holding firm against the November cold, no evidence remaining of what had been written there. Just a wall, just a garage, just a corner on a main street in a mountain town that was still, despite everything, exactly what it had been. Frank stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said quietly enough that only Claire could hear it. He'd have painted it himself first thing, wouldn't have waited for anyone. I know, she said. You waited for people, Frank said. That's different. That's better. He looked at her. He was solo. You're not. She felt that move through her. Not painfully, more like something being set down after a long carry set down properly in the right place with care. No, she said, I am not. They went back inside. Silver Creek closed out the year, the way it closed out every year, with the cold settling in for real and the main street taking on the particular quality of a place that knows what it is and isn't troubled by the knowing. The garage was warm, the land trust held. The Callahan building had joined the trust structure. In late November, Sandra's right of first refusal filing, having done exactly what Gerald said it would. The farmers market parking area was still in conversation. But Vera Hutchins had signed a letter of intent before she left for Arizona that made her co-owners' positions academic. Meridian Property Holdings had moved to a different market. Carter Voss had a new project somewhere in Wyoming, which was someone else's problem, and Silver Creek was no longer on his list. Ethan stayed through the winter. He'd planned to leave when his mother's recovery was complete, and her recovery was complete. But he stayed. He didn't explain this to anyone in particular. He just kept coming in, kept training in the evenings, kept helping Marcus on Saturdays, kept being part of what the town was, and the town kept being the kind of place that made sense to be part of. His mother never asked when he was leaving. She seemed to understand in the way that mothers understand things that their children haven't yet put into words, that the question had become more complicated than a departure date could answer. One evening in December, driving back from the gym, through the dark main street of Silver Creek, Ethan passed Morgan's garage. The lights were off. Claire had closed hours ago, but the building was there the way it was always there, solid and ordinary, and entirely itself. And the freshly painted wall caught his headlights briefly as he passed. I thought about the first time he'd driven past this building, that first morning he'd come into town loud and confident and looking for coffee. He'd barely registered it. A garage, some old equipment, a woman crouched over an engine, not looking up. He thought about how close he'd come to leaving Silver Creek, with that being the whole story. A town he'd passed through, a garage he'd walked into, a woman he'd misjudged completely and never known it. I thought about what it had cost him to find out what was actually here and what that cost had purchased, and whether he'd make the same trade knowing what he knew. He would, without question, without negotiation. He drove on through the dark toward home, toward the next morning, toward the person he was building himself into quietly without ceremony, in the company of people who had shown him that the most important things anyone ever builds are never built alone. Some lessons land once and stay forever. Some truths only become visible from certain distances. And some people, the strongest ones, the ones whose strength holds when everything is being tested, they never needed you to know who they were. They were that person whether you knew or not. Claire Morgan was that person long before Ethan Caldwell drove into Silver Creek. She would be that person long after he'd become someone worth knowing himself. And Silver Creek, ordinary, specific, irreducibly real, was still standing. That was the whole story, and it was more than enough.